Sooner. All right, I may as well start. And as people shuffle in, they'll just miss me talking, but not our main speaker. Okay, so I'm Jonathan Grobart. I'm the professor of political science here and chair of the political science department. I want to give a special thanks to the person or persons who have been tearing down these posters over the last several weeks. It's given me plenty of steps as I just put new ones up. So thank you. Okay, and so that's kind of a segue. But before I introduce Dr. Bartov, I have a few comments about the origins of bringing Dr. Bartov to speak at San Diego State. Last August, the director of Jewish Studies, Rebecca Bartel, invited me and our new faculty expert on Jewish Studies, Dr. Ishai Mishori, to discuss ideas for stimulating speakers for Jewish Studies for the academic year. So I had been following Dr. Bartov's recent public involvement as both a critic of Israel's assault on Gaza and a proponent of a transformed vision of coexistence for Jews and Arabs across Israel-Palestine. I did not know at the time that he was nearing completion of a new book, which came out really just a week ago or so, the 21st, and has already gained wide attention in the US and globally. The Guardian, the New York Times have all covered it. And happily, Dr. Bartov accepted the invitation from my colleague, Rebecca. Regrettably, people objected to both to Rebecca and to the dean's office about Jewish Studies being the sponsor. The objections seem to involve Dr. Bartov's public comments in the New York Times and elsewhere that Israel was engaged in a genocide in Gaza. Someone from the San Diego State President's office even asked if Dr. Bartov might be anti-Zionist, as if that was reason itself to not sponsor the talk. The fallout of all this was that Jewish Studies had to back away from sponsoring the talk. Fortunately, Dr. Emanuele Saccarelli, there he is, who's also the Bruce Porteous Professor and a colleague of mine in political science. He agreed to provide the funds needed, and to his credit, Dean Todd Butler of College of Arts and Letters also agreed. Both recognized the urgent need to maintain academic freedom in these scary times when the attacks on academic freedom and free expression on American college campuses have surged, maybe even surpassing the McCarthy era in some respects. Now on to introducing today's speaker. Born and raised in Israel, Omer Bartov received his Ph.D. at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He soon became a leading authority on the Nazi genocide. His early work uncovered the depth of Nazi indoctrination of the German army and the crimes perpetrated by the German army. Dr. Bartov later turned to interethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe up through World War II, which includes a close study of Jewish life in Galicia. As I emailed Dr. Bartov, I also have family from Galicia. His books, these aren't all of them, but they include Hitler's Army, Germany's War in the Holocaust, Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in Present-Day Ukraine, and I have this book here, Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz, winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Dr. Bartov has extended his scrutiny to Israel's oppression of Palestinians and intensifying turn toward violence and exclusion, extremism. In 2024, he resigned from the editorial board of Yad Vashem Studies, stating, quote, "To act as if the extraordinary carnage by Israeli troops, including the killing and maiming of thousands of children, is either none of its business or perfectly justified, will leave a stain on the journal and on Yad Vashem for the generations to come." On the affirmative side, Dr. Bartov belongs to a joint Israeli-Palestinian group supporting a new binational confederation known as A Land for All. As noted in its mission statement, A Land for All is devoted to, quote, "a simple and powerful truth. This land is home to two peoples. Any lasting resolution must affirm the equal right of both nations to self-determination, while honoring their unique identities, histories, and needs. Our lives are already inextricably intertwined, not only emotionally and historically, but in the most basic everyday ways. A shared peaceful future requires a political framework that reflects our interdependence alongside our separate needs. So tonight, Dr. Bartov discusses his new book, Israel, What Went Wrong. Let's welcome Dr. Bartov.
So this works, yes. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming here, and thank you for this kind introduction. I was asked not to give a formal talk, but to talk for about half an hour, introduce the book, or at least parts of it, and then to have an open discussion. So I'll try to do that. This book is an attempt to, as I say right at the opening, to understand how is it possible, at least that's the question that I pose to myself, how is it possible that Zionism, which was a movement that appeared in the late 19th century and was an attempt to emancipate, to liberate, and to protect the Jewish minority living particularly in Eastern Europe, and that was subjected increasingly to ethno-nationalism, exclusion, eventually violence, and at the end of this process to genocide, how this movement that tried to liberate and emancipate this group and that appealed to humanitarian sentiments around the world ended up being a state ideology dedicated increasingly to militarism, to exclusion, to violence against Palestinians, and eventually to ethnic cleansing, and as we saw in Gaza, to genocide. So what is the historical cycle? And are there particular moments at which this happened, this transition from an ideology for a group that was attacked, that was itself a minority, to one that became a merciless and racist state ideology? So in many ways, that's the question that I pose to myself in this book. I dedicate it to my father. I write in the dedication, I write, in loving memory of my father, the last Zionist. Now, I could go on at length to explain why I call him the last Zionist, but my father was born in 1926 in Palestine. He always belonged to the left, to various permutations of the left. He volunteered to fight in the Jewish brigade of the British Army as a 17-year-old. He encountered the survivors of the Holocaust as a young soldier. He then fought in the War of 1948. And he had a particular idealistic vision of Zionism. He was a staunch Zionist. And he lived to ripe old age. He died at the age of 90. In his last years, he became increasingly disenchanted with what he saw in Israel. And he spoke about Benjamin Netanyahu as what he saw as the wrecker of Zionism, of a particular vision that he had of Zionism, to the extent that my father was an author and a journalist and was quite well known in Israel, and he received the Israel Prize, which is the most prestigious prize in Israel. He was quite old when he received that prize, and he said that he refused to die until he received it. So, but waited until he did. And when he was at the ceremony, this prize is given to you by the prime minister. And he walked on the stage. He was quite old and frail with a cane. And he walked right past the prime minister. He refused to shake his hand, which created a bit of kerfuffle in the media. And I tell you this story not because I necessarily shared all of my father's view about Zionism, and I myself left Israel halfway through my life in my mid-30s, which for him was always very difficult that I left that country, but because there was a different vision of Zionism. And while there was plenty of room to criticize it, it was not what we have now, what it has become in recent years. So how has that happened? So the book tries to trace that, and I'll say just a few things. My understanding of the evolution of that ideology is that in the 1920s and 30s, when Palestine is under British rule, Britain has the mandatory power over Palestine following World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and Britain is committed to creating what was in the 1917 Balfour Declaration and then rolled into the mandatory documents to create a Jewish national home in Palestine. It doesn't quite, it's sort of explicit on what that means, but it's a kind of vague term. And for the first 15 years of British mandatory rule, Britain is the main facilitator of the creation of a proto-Jewish state in Palestine. During those years, two things are happening at the same time. One thing is that in Europe, where the vast majority of the Jews live, 80% of world Jewry live in Europe, and most of them in Eastern Europe, there is a growth of violence, anti-Semitism, political, governmental anti-Semitism, and persecution. And there are fewer and fewer places to which Jews can go. The United States passes very strict immigration laws in the early 1920s, greatly restricting Jewish immigration to the United States. In other European countries, especially after the Great Depression from 1929 on, do not want immigrants. Of course, echoes of today, because they don't want foreigners to come in and take jobs from their own people. And so the only place in many ways during the 1920s and into the early 30s for Jews to go is increasingly Palestine. And so the argument that Zionism makes since the late 19th century, that it would create a safe haven for Jews, appears to be correct. That's the only place that they can go to. But once the Jews come to Palestine, a new dynamic is created. That is, Palestine is not empty. Zionism had a slogan that a people without a land, because the Jews were landless in Europe, to a land without a people, based on the fiction that since the Jews were exiled 2,000 years earlier, the land remained empty, waiting for them to come back. But when they come, turns out it's not empty. There are people living there. And the people living there are subjected increasingly to the usual dynamics of a settler colonial movement. That is, that as the Jews are coming into Palestine, they are encroaching on Palestinian lands, on Palestinian life, with the help of the British Empire. And so you have these two dynamics. One is the positive one, if you could call it that Zionism is providing a safe haven. And the negative one is that as it's creating its proto-state, it is encroaching on Palestinian land and creating naturally resistance to that from Palestinian Arabs in that part of the world. Now then, of course, I won't go through all the history, In 1939, following the Arab uprising of 1936, which is an attempt by Palestinians to remove British rule and to own the land that they live in, and to stop this dynamic of Jewish migration into Palestine, which is brutally suppressed by the British Army. In 1939, the British authorities pass the White Paper, which actually promises to create an Arab state in which there would be a Jewish minority, and greatly limits Jewish immigration into Palestine. That's on the eve of World War II. At the end of World War II, those masses of Jews that Zionism believed would come to Palestine, would create what Zionism wanted, which was a Jewish majority state, they're gone. They've mostly been murdered. And the British Empire by then is exhausted by World War II and decides to leave Palestine. It wants to give up its mandatory rule in Palestine. And the UN passes a partition resolution, a resolution that would partition Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state, as it is called in Resolution 181 on the 29th of November, 1947. The Palestinians, the leadership of the Palestinians in Palestine and the Arab states reject that offer on the grounds that it is unfair, because even though the Zionists tried throughout the 20s and 30s and after World War II to bring as many Jews as they could, in 1947, 2/3 of the population of Palestine are Palestinians, and only 1/3 are Jews. But the partition resolution gives the Jewish state just over half of the territory. So it's obviously on the face of it an unfair partition, and one that would also have left vast numbers of Palestinians living in what would become the Jewish state. And this evolves into a civil war within Palestine itself, first between the Jewish population and the Palestinian population, and then with the invasion of several Arab armies to support the Palestinians. At the end of that war, the Jews win. The Zionist state the state of Israel is created. And in the process of that war, the Jewish leadership makes an effort and succeeds in creating a Jewish majority state, not by receiving all those millions of people who can no longer come because they've all been murdered, but by expelling the vast majority of the Palestinians in what becomes the Jewish state, which is actually bigger than what would have been the state under the partition. Takes over 80% of mandatory Palestine. So about 750,000 Palestinians are expelled, either intimidated into fleeing or physically expelled with a great deal of violence. And on the 14th of May, 1948, as the British are leaving, they're supposed to leave by May 15th, the leadership of the Zionists in Palestine issues a declaration of a state, which is known in Israel as the Declaration of Independence. It's never quite clear independence from whom, because the British are leaving anyway, but that's what it is called. And that Declaration of Independence, partly in order to allow Israel to become part of the UN, makes several lofty statements on what kind of state it would be. It provides a Bill of Rights, and it says that all citizens of that state would have equal rights, no matter their religion, no matter their ethnic origin or race. It also promises to pass a constitution vote for a constitution by October of that year, 1948. We're still waiting for that constitution. It never actually happened. And that constitution was supposed to be in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. So that's a crucial moment. That's a moment at which the state, for a variety of reasons, decides not to have a constitution. It also never recognizes its own borders. It never declares what the borders of that state would be. And because there is no constitution, what happens to Zionism, which actually accomplished what it set out to do, it created the Jewish majority state by fire and sword, right? It kicked out the Palestinians, created the Jewish majority state. Zionism, instead of being sent to the archives as a historical document, becomes the state ideology without any constitutional limits on what it can do. That creates a particular dynamic. Now, that is not to say that everything was predetermined after that moment. There are many moments in which there were attempts both to pass constitutional laws, particularly in the early 1990s, and to bring in a constitution through the back door, and of course, to regulate relations, to find some accommodation for relations between Palestinians and Jews. Between 1949 and 1967, Israel is a Jewish majority state within the borders of 1967. But it's really a democracy only for about 6 months. Because right as the state is created, not only does the state as it is being created say that it would be tolerant of the Palestinian minority, it is in the process of making the majority into a minority. That is, people are being expelled, Palestinians are being expelled even as the state is declared, so that there would be a minority. Immediately after the creation of the state, at the end of the war, the Palestinian population that remains in Israel, in the state of Israel, about 150,000 at the time, now it's 2 million, is subjected to military rule. And that military rule lasts for 20 years, until December 1966. And it's lifted in December 1966 after most of its goals have been accomplished, meaning the confiscation of vast tracts of land that belonged to the Palestinians who remained in Palestine or in the state of Israel now. So between December 1966 and June 1967, there is, so to speak, a democracy. All citizens, Palestinians and Jews, and the Palestinians are about 20% of the population, have full rights that they can exercise, at least in theory. But of course, in June 1967, Israel takes over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many of whom were expelled in 1948. And so it takes over the population that it expelled. And initially, it speaks about using those lands as a bargaining chip for peace with the Arab states, but very quickly it gets used to having the territory, not so much the people living in it. And from that point on, I was 13 in 1967. In 1967, I'm now 72. So a whole lifetime, Israel is a 50-50 state. It's a state in which now there's 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians. Of the 7 million Palestinians, 2 million are Israeli citizens, but they have limited rights. And in 2018, Israel passed a constitutional law, Israel, the nation state of the Jews, which even limits their rights even more by law. 3 million are in the West Bank and 2 million in Gaza. Those in the West Bank live under military rule. It's arbitrary military rule. Those in Gaza, as we know right now, are living in the most dire conditions imaginable. Most of them are unhoused and have no infrastructure following what occurred in Gaza. So in a sense, since 1967, we are talking about a condition whereby what Zionism had dreamt of creating, that is a Jewish majority state, was undone by Zionism itself, wanting the land, but not wanting the population there, and thinking, how can we somehow remove that population? Keep the land, but not have the people in it. So this is a particular dynamic that we can trace from 1948 and then from 1967 to the present. I want to say three more things before I wrap up and we open up. One is that there are two, and I talk about it at some length in the book, there are two main components to the creation of a particular Israeli identity, mentality, psychology, self-perception. One is the role that the Holocaust has increasingly come to play in Israeli consciousness and identity. Now, one would have thought that as time went by and the Holocaust receded in time, people would look at it as an important historical episode and a tragedy for the Jewish people, but something that you learn about, something that happened in the past. But in fact, the opposite happened. And in Israel, in some ways, beginning with the Eichmann trial in the early 1960s, but increasingly after the war of 1973, with the rise of the Israeli right to power in 1977, the Holocaust starts playing a very different role in Israeli identity. It becomes a kind of social glue. It's something that people start thinking of the one thing they have in common, whether they're secular or religious, whether they live in the cities or in the periphery, whether they're young or they're old, whether they're Ashkenazi or Mizrahi, and Israel has a large population of people from North Africa and the Middle East, and of course a large Russian population. The one thing they have in common is that they might have been, or maybe some of the ancestors were, victims of the Holocaust. And that the Holocaust is not only something that happened in the past, the Holocaust is an imminent danger, that any threat to that country can bring about its extinction. And that becomes increasingly politically important in how Israelis and Israeli governments and educational facilities talk about the Holocaust not as a past event, but also as an immediate danger, which means that anyone who challenges the state, anyone who threatens the state in some way, may indeed be seen as trying to bring about its extinction. And if that is the case, then all bets are off. Then Israel may be a member of the UN, may accept international law, but when its bare existence, when it believes that its bare existence is at stake, then it can do whatever it likes. And no one has a right, seeing that the nations of the world, as they say in Israel, did nothing during the Holocaust, no one has any right to tell it otherwise. So in that sense, the Holocaust has started playing the role of providing the state with a license to violence. The second important element is the occupation. And the occupation, when I was 17 in high school, just before I went to the army, and I spent 4 years in the army, and I spent months in the West Bank. I spent a year in Gaza. This is in the 1970s. I was there in the war of 1973. But just before I went to the army, I was sort of part of a very small group, and we used to demonstrate against the occupation, which had just happened, right? The occupation begins in 67, and we're talking about 1970, 71, and we would hold these posters that said, "Occupation corrupts." Now, we had no inkling how much occupation corrupts when we did that, and how much it has corrupted Israeli society. When you rule over another people, how do you do that? What do you do in order to keep people down? Generations of young Israeli men and women have served as occupation soldiers against a population that is increasingly and understandably resentful and rebellious and unaccepting of that occupation. So how do you do it? You break into people's home at 4 a.m. You drag old people out of their beds. You break children's toys. You stop them at checkpoints as they're going to hospitals. You humiliate them. You treat them like animals. And as I cite, as Aimé Césaire writes in his discourse on colonialism, you think of the other side as animals, and in the process, you yourself become brutalized. You yourself become an animal. And that is something that is deeply corrupted Israeli society. And that brings me to the last point, which is what happened on October 7th. So on October 7th, 2023, as you know, there was a major Hamas attack. Hamas and other organizations, Islamic Jihad and other people who broke through the fence and reached Israeli settlements around the Gaza Strip, murdered approximately 800 civilians. They also killed several hundred soldiers. And people sort of chide me for saying 800, but of course the others were soldiers, and that's a very different matter. But they murdered 800 civilians. There were reported cases of rape, of abuse. They also took 251 hostages. So what Hamas carried out was a war crime by any standard and a crime against humanity because of the large number of civilians who were targeted and killed and often abused. The Israeli response to that was the kind of response that we have seen before in colonial regimes when the locals, when the indigenous population rebels. That is, it's to put them back in their place. The Israeli army felt deeply humiliated. The Israeli government proved itself to be incompetent. There was a deep sense of insecurity in the Israeli public. No one expected that Hamas could do anything like that, could take over vast tracts of Israeli territory, sometimes for 2, even 3 days before the army, which is a modern army with tanks, with airplanes, with artillery, with a navy. It's not a bunch of people with AK-47s. So the sense of rage and humiliation was such that the Israeli public in many ways gave license to the army and to the government to eradicate Gaza. And what happened, and my interpretation of that has been that there was a particular idea, there was what is called a concept, and as a political strategic concept. There was one also before the war of 1973, was called the Conceptia in Hebrew, and there are similarities between October 6, 1973 and October 7, 2023. But the concept before the Hamas attack was, as Netanyahu sold it to the public and to much of the rest of the world, Israel can manage the occupation. We don't have to resolve this issue, we can manage it. And October 7th, which is what Hamas tried to demonstrate, exploded that concept. And the question was for the people in government, which is the most right-wing government in Israeli history, was what do we do? The old concept is gone. We cannot manage the occupation. And the decision was to ethically cleanse Gaza. Or as one Israeli minister said, Avi Dichter, former head of the Shabak, of the security services, we are doing Nakba 0.2. The Nakba is the name of the expulsion in 1948, the catastrophe. But the difference between 1948 and 2023, 24 is that in 1948, the Palestinians could cross over. The borders were open. And hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled either by boat or on foot to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Syria. In 2023, 2024, the borders were closed. there was no place to go to. You couldn't cross the Israeli borders, of course, because the Israelis would not allow it, and you couldn't cross in the much smaller corridor over to Egypt because the Egyptians would not allow it. And so people were trapped inside the Gaza Strip. And what was thought of as an operation of ethnic cleansing to just get rid of that population became a genocidal operation, very much like many other genocides in the past. This is not, I can cite many cases, including the Holocaust, which begins as an attempt to get rid of the Jews in areas controlled by Germany and ends up as a genocide. This attempt at ethnic cleansing became genocidal, and the future of that, the ethnic cleansing failed, but Gaza was made uninhabitable. We can talk about what is the future of that. I've been writing about that. It's kind of scary as I see it. But the ethnic cleansing failed, and yet Gaza was made not only uninhabitable, but what the Israeli military did was destroy everything that makes for a group to be able to live there and to be able to reconstitute itself as a group. And if you've ever looked at the Genocide Convention of 1948, which is called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and of which Israel and France and Germany and the UK and the United States are signatories, that convention defines genocide as the attempt or acts carried out with the intent of destroying a particular group, a national group, or ethnic, religious, or racial group, in whole or in part as such. And what the IDF carried out in Gaza was to destroy the entire infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals, the mosques, the archives, the museums, everything, so as to make it impossible for that group, as far as they could, to reconstitute itself as a group. And the last thing I'll say is that, to me, and as you heard, I mean, I was born in Israel, I was raised there, I served in the army for 4 years. I have friends there, I have a son there, I have grandchildren there. To see what that country carried out in the last 2.5 years, and to see the extraordinary denial of that, of what everybody knows happened, the unwillingness to face up to the facts, the indifference to the brutalization of that population is shocking and extremely painful. And that's the reason that I personally believe that Zionism as an ideology is bankrupt. It has to be removed. States don't get removed. The state of Israel has to reconstitute itself, has to make itself into something else. But it can only do that, as was mentioned, through the various ways of thinking about it. One is the idea of a confederation, but it can only reconstitute itself in a way that would enable the 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews who live between the Jordan and the sea to share that space. And they can share it in various ways that they want to, but they have to share it with equality and dignity for all groups. And Zionism as a state ideology today does not allow that. That's not part of the Zionist point of view. That kind of Zionism is bankrupt, and the reliance on the history of the Holocaust, of the largest genocide in the modern era at least, in order to justify another genocide, has entirely discredited this kind of justification. And that too, I think, will no longer be a usable political tool. So I stop here, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bartov. There was a part of me was tempted just to have a series of questions, but I kind of realize that probably all of you here want to ask questions. So I'll limit myself to 2 questions for now. And if by some chance there's silence at some point, I can ask more, but I don't think we'll have silence. Okay, so I have two big questions that are based on your book. One is really thinking about both Zionism, like what does it mean, Zionism now, and what does anti-Zionism mean? I asked as someone who's personally wary of getting lost in these absolute ideologies at the expense of just focused discussion on Jewish-Arab coexistence in Palestine, Israel. I'll refer you and the audience to a thoughtful interview that Israeli journalist Ari Shavit had with the distinguished Palestinian American scholar Edward Said back in 2000. I'll read a little bit of it. Shavit, what you are saying is that Israelis should know that, like white South Africans, they have a right to stay as long as they give up their ideology. Said, yes, an ideology that denies the rights of others. Shavit, so what is needed is a process of de-Zionization? Said, I don't like to use words like that because that's obviously a signal that I'm asking the Zionists to commit harakiri. They can be Zionists and they can assert their Jewish identity and their connection to the land so long as it doesn't keep the others out so manifestly. So let's say reformed, not getting rid of Zionism. And you've kind of said it, but I just want to pin you down a little bit more about where you come out now. Do you think it's fully necessary to fully renounce the idea of Zionism as something that can no longer be salvaged, given how long it has operated more as Jewish supremacy and oppression of Palestinians? Or is there some way, I mean, if we still want some idea of Jewish self-determination in that land, is there a hope of trying to transform the meaning of Zionism?
So look, I mean, I'll say 2 things. First of all, people talk about the Zionists or the anti-Zionists. I try to think what anti-Zionism means. And I'm not a big fan of anti-things, you know, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, anti-whatever, anti-colonialism. It's an anti is not really an ideology. It's being against something. So I don't exactly know what that means, but I know that Zionism originally, as I was trying to describe it, is the claim that Jews, like any other group, and it's a claim that's created at the time that many groups are declaring that themselves, Jews have a right of self-determination. And I think any group that wishes to declare itself as a nation, not something that I'm particularly enamored of, because I know that what Horror's nationalism has brought not only to Palestinians, but throughout Europe and in other parts of the world. But if a group wants to declare itself as a nation and to establish some kind of state, some kind of political entity, I don't think that we have a right to tell it not to do so. What it does not have a right is to do that through oppressing another group or other groups. So the question is not whether Jews have a right to a state or have a right to self-determine. The question is, how do you exercise that right? And the exercise of that right over time, with the kind of ethno-nationalism that Zionism had become, has been very violent and very oppressive. And that is, by now, has become part of the DNA of Zionist ideology. Zionism has changed a lot over the years. It was largely a secular movement. It's now a religious movement. It proclaimed affinities with socialism, with justice. It has thrown all of that out. It proclaimed to be vehemently anti-racist, and it has become racist. So that kind of Zionism, I don't think has a right to keep on existing. but the state will remain. There were many states that had criminal regimes. There were states that had far worse regimes than the regime that Israel has now. And those regimes are gone, but the states are still there. I mean, I'm a German historian. You know, there were people in 1945 in London and in Washington who said Germany should be done away with. It should be turned into an agricultural land, which meant that there would be millions of people who would die of hunger. But what actually happened was that the French and the Soviets and the Americans and the Brits occupied Germany. And what did the Americans do? For the wrong reasons, of course, not only for the love of humanity, they instituted the Marshall Plan and a process of denazification, which was not that successful, but at least implied that you have to, the state remained. And the state over time changed. It really changed. Germany is not what it was in 1943. So the notion that you do away with the state itself has genocidal elements to it. You wipe it out, you destroy it. So in that sense, I think that Israel has to reinvent itself. If it doesn't do it and it doesn't show any inclination to doing that, it will become, and is becoming right now, a full-blown apartheid state. An apartheid state not only in the West Bank, which it is already, and a genocidal state in Gaza, which it is already, but also vis-a-vis Palestinian citizens of Israel, and also against all those Jewish citizen elements that oppose this process. So it will be a very violent state. It'll become increasingly isolated. It will become a pariah state. Jewish communities around the world will want to distance themselves from it because they are minorities where they live. And it's very hard for a minority to support Jewish supremacy over there. It's a contradiction in terms. And eventually it will implode because it won't be able to sustain itself. And we saw what happened with South Africa in 1994, but it might be much more violent than what happened in South Africa. In South Africa, there was a moment where the leaders emerged who could make the transition from what many people feared would be a horrific bloodbath. And that may happen in this kind of state. So what I'm talking about is that the state has to rethink itself. What is it about? Now, realistically, I don't think that Jewish Israelis or Palestinians, for that matter, right now have the internal dynamic to make this paradigm shift, and that's what it is, to rethink relations that have been established since 1948 on their own. I don't think it exists right now. So where will it come from? It would be better if it came from the outside. It would be better if Israel had what I've called shock therapy. And October 7th was not that shock therapy. October 7th actually brought out all the demons in Israeli society. Shock therapy means that Israeli citizens will finally be brought back to understand the limits of the power of their state, which have been for a long time set in Washington, D.C. and not in Jerusalem, so that Israel can conduct politics only with bombs. It doesn't need to do diplomacy because it has full military support from the United States. It has economic support from the US and from the EU, even greater. And it has a diplomatic iron dome because the US uses its veto power in the Security Council, which is the enforcement agency of the UN. If Israel were put back in its place, not out of vengeance or a desire to destroy it, but to actually change the shape of politics, which I think most, and you may not believe it, that's my sense, most Israeli citizens and most Palestinians living under Israeli rule would like to see a different future. They don't like the way their lives right now. it's not a good life. They feel insecure. They're scared. Their economy is going down the drain. They would like to see something else, but they don't trust anyone. They don't trust their own leaders. They don't trust their own governments. If there were pressure from the outside that would facilitate this paradigm change, I think it would be welcome. And in many ways, that's actually the role of American citizens, who are those who, at least for now, elect their governments and can put pressure on their government not to abandon Israel and say, just to hell with these people, but to help it become something else. And that would diffuse much of the tension that we have throughout that region, because what people don't understand is that everything that is going on, Israel now is fighting in Lebanon and in Syria and in the West Bank and in Gaza and Iran and Yemen, in all these fronts. It's all about one thing. It's all about Israeli rule over Palestinians. That is what has to be changed. Sunni Arab states have wanted to normalize relations with Israel now for 20 years. But there is a price to that. And the price is to have a different relationship between Jews and Palestinians in that land. And so that's what I'm really talking about when I say this kind of Zionism has to go, because it's an ideology that is only about blood and oppression. And it's never about compromise and relations between two groups. It has completely given up on that notion.
One more question. It's kind of on the starting point of when Israel or when Zionism went wrong. Your book's longest chapter is on the failure in Israel's early years to develop a constitution based on liberal democratic principles and full equality for all, something that was supposed to be part of the package set forth in the UN 1947 partition resolution. It's a terrific chapter. I learned a lot, very good in discussing the Supreme Court, Israeli Supreme Court in the 1990s, and the whole notion of the paradox of being Jewish and democratic. Yet I'm not convinced that the failure to develop a constitution in the early years was the turning point for Israel's Zionism. So I'm dubious that even if somehow Ben-Gurion's will had been thwarted back then, and Israel had established that kind of constitution, that it would have made Israel less discriminatory toward Palestinians. I mean, I think to begin with, as you know, it is almost certain the Constitution would have included a provision that gives a privileged status to Israel's Jewish character. Second, it seems the prevailing political climate in this new state of Israel was decidedly opposed to any significant liberalization, much less equality with regard to Israel's now minority Palestinian population after the Nakba. Hence, I believe the Constitution would have been interpreted in a way that institutionalized inequality, not put some sort of check on it, which you argued with qualifications. So I guess then my question is, would you agree now that the actual turning point, or maybe this already is something you agreed with, was long before 1948? It's when the prevailing Zionist movement attached Jewish self-determination to a Jewish nation state that demanded some kind of hegemonic status for the state's Jews, and therefore an overwhelming Jewish majority. So in other words, was the original sin when the prevailing Zionist movement linked Jewish self-determination to a Jewish nation state?
So I just want to ask you, so do you think
Yes.
that was a turning point?
Yes. So that's the topic of my book. So it's a plug for my book, though I know today we're not discussing my book. Okay.
Okay. Look, I'm not sure that's a turning point. I think that's the origin, but I'm not sure it's a turning point. So all nationalisms, particularly ethno-nationalisms. And Zionism was just borrowing whole chapters from other ethno-nationalisms where it was growing up, from Ukrainians, from Poles, from the Germans. It was, you can see, I studied those nationalisms, and it's quite striking. They're so similar, and they're just borrowing things. Like this idea that you take nice urban kids who have never really been to the countryside, and you teach them to love their land, right? You take them on journeys, know thy land. So you tell them your roots are in that land, although they've never been there. And so yes, ethno-nationalism has a particular dynamic. And there've been many such ethno-nationalisms, and they all had more or less violent turns. So the question is this what makes Zionism different? One thing is very different between Zionism and Ukrainian or Polish nationalism, for instance, which is that ethno-nationalism is two things. It's about the ethnos and it's about the territory, right? You are the people of this place, tutai, you are from here, right? Well, the Jews were not from there. That was the whole point. That's what they were being told. They're not from there. They don't belong to Ukraine. They don't belong to Poland. That was the one thing. That's what I write about in the other book that you mentioned. I mean, the one thing the Polish and Ukrainian nationalists agreed on was the only one thing, that the Jews do not belong to the state that they want to create. Obviously, not the Poles in the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainians in the Polish state, but the Jews, there's an agreement on that. So the territory had to be found elsewhere. And yes, once that territory was identified as the ancestral land of the Jews, as Eretz Israel, then Zionism started doing exactly what the other ethno-nationalisms were doing. It was identifying people who live in the land who don't belong there. And for the Zionists, basically, the indigenous population in the Zionist fantasy were Arabs who could live elsewhere. Why do they live in our land? So in that sense, this dynamic is not at all special to Zionism. So what I try to understand is, okay, this we can see in many cases of nationalism, but in each case there's also another point beyond that point of origin. And yes, it is true, had there been a constitution, there were many states that had constitutions and it didn't help them very much. I mean, Turkey has had a constitution, right? Several. And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a democracy or that minorities are respected there and so forth. True. But you can also imagine a moment in which, at the birth of the state, which is, as I said, very violent, right? It's a moment of ethnic cleansing. The state is declared while ethnic cleansing is happening. It's simultaneous. That the state would limit itself, that it would set limits on itself, that it would, if it had a constitution in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, which was imposed on it by the UN, of course. It's not that they really wanted to have a Bill of Rights, but they wanted to be part of the international community. And a lot of states do things they don't want to do because of other things. Germany had a restitution agreement with Israel, not because he wanted it, but because he wanted to be taken back into the international community. And it cost a lot of money to do that, but it was worth it. And that's what the Zionists did also in 1948. That constitution could have, it's not assured, of course not, but could have made it much more difficult, for instance, for the Israeli Supreme Court, which would have been bound by a constitution, to allow 20 years of military rule over 20% of the population and massive takeover of land. It might have, again, it's not certain, but it might have created some dynamic to say that if we want to normalize our relations with the rest of the Arab world and with Palestinians, to find some kind of solution, which was being discussed in Israel after 1948, to have some of those who were expelled come back, to have a process of restitution for some of them, to pay back for property that was taken over and would not be given back. because there would have been a legal framework that would have made it more difficult to ignore all of that. Now, is it certain? No, of course not. And there were many other points in that history. I didn't mention that when I was speaking earlier. There is a point in the early 90s with the Oslo process, with all the problems that there were in this process, that both Israeli Jews and Palestinians, both Palestinian citizens of Israel and occupied Palestinians, are beginning to think that maybe things will change. And there's more talk in Israel at the time of a state of all its citizens. People forget it, but it was very common. Suddenly people spoke, what is the state of all its citizens? It's a state that is not simply both Jewish and democratic. That is, it's more democratic than Jewish. Now, that process ended largely because Rabin was assassinated. It was one of the most successful assassinations of the 20th century. And his blood is on Netanyahu's hands to this day, because this was incitement by Netanyahu that caused it. But there was a moment that you could see that. And if you try to understand what happened in Israel once this particular government came into place at the end of 2022, the so-called judicial overhaul, which is really a judicial coup that is ongoing to change the legal nature of the state, it is an attempt to thwart those attempts that were being made in the 1990s to make the state more akin to a constitutional state. There were constitutional laws that were being passed, and those are anathema to the right-wing racist elements within Israel. And so they're trying to overturn that, which means that they know that there is an alternative and they want to prevent it. So I'm not saying it would have been, everything would have been honky-dory. Yeah, we'd have a constitution, everybody would be happy, but it would have made a difference. The reason that a constitution was not adopted was not simply because Ben-Gurion didn't feel like having a constitution. And when you read the literature, I was reading all of that, it's quite interesting. The argument that was made then, and is still being made by Israeli legal experts, is that it was about the Orthodox. Because the Jewish Orthodox said, we don't need a constitution, we have the Torah. Who needs a constitution? That's the law for the Jews. And the state had to, Ben-Gurion had a sort of idea of a status quo between the religious and secular elements in Israel. Of course, that status quo has changed in the sense that now the religious are more numerous than the secular. At the time, it was the other way around. But what is not spoken about is that it was actually about the Palestinians. And that legal discourse, it's only between the lines that you can read it. It was about, what do we do with the Palestinians? How can we have a Jewish democratic state if we don't have equal rights for a group that is not Jewish? How do we do it? And that was not resolved. And I believe it is the core issue in Israel, and at least struggling with a constitution would have made that much higher on the political agenda than it was.
All right, well, now I'll turn it over to questions. I found it's best if I want to spread questions out to have 3 at a time, unless you find that too confusing.
No, I'll try to remember.
Good. All right. So you can ask questions, make comments, just try not to go on too long because we want to spread it out. Okay, so anyone on this side? Okay, at the end over there. What did I say first? Oh, you're first. Sorry, second. And who was the third? I didn't have a third. Okay, Ahmed. Okay, good. Okay, fair enough. Okay.
So, first off, I want to say thank you very much for coming here, and thank you all to everyone who made this possible. My question is, do you think we're going to end up seeing something more akin to Gaza and the West Bank? Because I'm more and more worried that something more akin to Rwanda could happen there when it seems more and more likely that we're going down not the South Africa path, but West Bank guys Gaza or whatever the terminology would be. Do you think, there's more hope for something less violent and genocidal, or do you think we're down that avenue?
Would it be possible to repeat the question before the answer?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good for the crowd, good for the Zoom crowd.
Yeah, the what's your name?
Dylan.
Dylan? Dylan. So Dylan is asking, what do I think is the future right now for Gaza and the West Bank? Are we heading down the same route, let's say, as what happened in Rwanda, meaning ethnic cleansing and genocide, or is there some other alternative? Where is this going, right? Yeah, next one.
There was a second before. What did I say was second? Okay. Sorry, my short-term memory's off. Okay.
My question is that you mentioned at some point that the memory of the Holocaust was like repurposed like the social fabric in Israel to create this fear. And my question is, that to me, I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors, but when I speak to Jewish Zionists, they're not just fearful that there's a Holocaust. They are completely convinced that it's going to happen, and they are actively terrified. It's bizarre to me because some of these people are not even relatives of Holocaust survivors. My question, I guess, is how did this really come about in Israeli society? Like, what were the vehicles in which they perpetuated this way of thinking about the Holocaust, and how can that be undone, or does it have to be undone for a better future?
Thanks.
So if that was a question about the follow-up about the Holocaust, about this view that's genuine, that the Holocaust really could happen again, particularly that perception in Israel. And Ahmed.
And I want to ask about the American context, especially right-wing populism. And what we see now, there's an increasing reference to religion from the US ambassador to some senators, referring to Bible and justifying the support in religious terms. And Netanyahu government seems to be happy strategically, and also including, as you said, the most right-wing Orthodox and ultra-nationalist government. But I may expect a secularist backlash in the United States. It's not surprising that there will be a secularist backlash in American politics. And if something like, first of all, do you think Israeli politics may have a resurgence of secular elements? And if we see both in America and Israel, less religious, more secular politics, would that be a contribution to solution? And the second thing, if this religious rhetoric continues, the right wing in America, in Europe, they may also end up with very anti-Semitic. Isn't it dangerous for Israel strategically to see the rise of right-wing politics in the both sides of Atlantis?
I'll give a try of summarizing that. So on the one hand, is the Israeli government's appeal toward religious nationalism throughout the world ultimately self-defeating in terms of increasing intolerance, including toward Jews? Secondly, is there a possibility of a growth of secularism in the United States and elsewhere that can be a problem to Israel's current strategy? Is that
Or maybe solution?
or solution? Right. Okay.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief. Dylan, so I've actually been thinking about this, and I was writing something this morning on this. What is the future? First of all, what is the future of the genocide in Gaza? Because in Israel, in the US, and also many people in Europe say, well, maybe it wasn't, but let's move on. But where are we right now? So there is the Trump plan, the 20-point plan. What is that plan? What does it actually mean? So one option is that this is going to be an unprecedented case in which not only was genocide carried out with impunity, and not only is there won't be any accountability, but everybody will profit from that genocide apart from those who were its victims. That they will build this Riviera City 140 glass towers in part of Gaza. More than half of it is on the other side of the yellow line, which is where the IDF is sitting, and that will become area for Jewish settlements. And what will happen to the Palestinians who are there? They will be put in humanitarian cities, so-called, and they will be the workforce for the rich and wealthy who will come to live in these beautiful towers. So the Arab countries that will fund it will do it because it'll put them in a good place with the United States. Israel will definitely be happy about it. Real estate moguls such as Jared Kushner and Witkoff and Trump and Coultry will benefit from it. The United States will establish itself in the region again, and the Palestinians will be the water carriers. And the one thing that this will completely prevent is any accountability. So that's sort of one nightmarish, but not impossible future. You're talking about whether there's a Rwanda type of response. What there is, I think, and I must say that years before October 7th, not only me, there were many people who thought that there might be a trigger at which Israeli governments, the military, the settlers, will use that trigger to try and carry out ethnic cleansing. And the thought was actually about the West Bank much more than Gaza. What nobody, I think, that I know predicted was that it could go on for so long. The assumption was that if they tried to do that within a week or a month, the international community would stop it. And it didn't. And it continued. And it's still going on. What I think is happening right now on the West Bank, of course, is an attempt by the Israeli authorities to incite the population to eventually, and they've not succeeded, to eventually rise up, because that will be the trigger to try and carry out massive ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. But that not happening, there is encroaching, there's constant encroachment. And that is quite effective right now because nobody is paying attention. And that makes life for Palestinians in the West Bank increasingly impossible. So it's possible that there will be a moment of mass violence. It's possible that we'll continue seeing these weekly pogroms. You know, after October 7th, there were people who said that the attack by Hamas was a pogrom. Of course, it was not a pogrom. A pogrom is something that is done against a minority, not against a state. But the pogroms that are happening, the violence on the West Bank are pogroms by the settlers, supported by the military, who are usually settlers in uniform. So I think, yes, it's a possibility, but it may not be the most effective thing for Israel. And it's much more effective for those people who are running the state now to keep this encroachment because they're now taking over Area C, which is the one that it's not supposed to be at all under Israeli control. On Holocaust memory, you know, I was just thinking in 1988, in March 1988, there was an article in Haaretz by an actual Holocaust survivor, not somebody who traces themselves back 3 generations. And sometimes, as you indicate, people claim sort of credit for the fact that their relatives were victims or almost victims of the Holocaust, but someone who actually survived as a child. He was my professor, his name was Yehuda Elkanah, and he wrote an article in Haaretz in March 1988 called In Praise of Forgetting. And what he spoke about was that the constant harping on the Holocaust in schools in Israel is brutalizing Israeli youth to exercise violence against Palestinians. He wrote it in response to what Rabin at the time, who we remember later on as being sort of part of the Oslo Accords, as I mentioned before, Rabin at the time said to IDF soldiers, you should break their arms and legs of Palestinian youths who were throwing rocks at heavily armed soldiers. And that's what they did. They actually took them literally. So this kind of use of that memory, Elkanah, who could write that without being lynched in Israel at the time because he was a Holocaust survivor, so he had a bit of credit, so to speak, that since then has intensified to a huge extent, this use of the Holocaust. When in 1982, Menachem Begin, who was then prime minister, when Israel was besieging Beirut after the invasion of Lebanon, said that Arafat in Beirut is like Hitler in his bunker. And of course, after October 7th, immediately the Israeli media was filled with these statements, Hamas Nazis. So once you call people Nazis, then, and then they said there are no uninvolved people in Gaza. So Hamas are Nazis, and everybody is involved. And people were saying openly on the Israeli media, killing children is fine because they will grow up to be Hamasniks, meaning Nazis. So that is first of all a distortion and abuse of the actual memory of the Holocaust. And it's tragic for someone like me who taught the Holocaust for decades to see the use of the memory of the Holocaust to justify brutality. And secondly, I have to say that it's happened to me a number of times that people spoke to defend Israel by saying that their grandparents were in the Holocaust. And I, for the life of me, I don't understand the kind of logic that is being used. Why would you have the right to destroy people because your relatives 3 generations ago were subjected to genocide? Germany has this problem. Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, is known to have made a statement in the Israeli Knesset that Germany's Staatsräson, which is like the reason of state of Germany, the core principle of Germany is to defend Israel. That's not the lesson of the Holocaust. The lesson of the Holocaust, if you perpetrated it, is to protect the regime of international law that was created in response to that, and not to allow another state, whether it's a Jewish state or any other state, to do the same. That's not. So there is a warping and an abuse of this event, rather than actually what people claim to do, which is to honor it, to remember it, and to learn from it. And I think people have to be exposed for doing that. Much of the debate over the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is also caught up in this idea that anything you say about the state of Israel may be anti-Semitic, therefore anti-Semitism leads to the Holocaust, and therefore you cannot criticize a state that is clearly engaged in criminal actions. And quickly on the last question, so in the United States, it's interesting, right? There's Christian Zionism, which exists in the United States, existed also in Britain already in the 19th century. But there's also the rise of Christian nationalism. And Christian nationalism is not the same as Christian Zionism. Christian nationalism can actually is Christian supremacist, is white supremacist. And that doesn't include Jews, that they're not white enough for that. So there is a struggle. And as you indicate, and I think it's true, that the kind of attempt to shut down criticism of Israel by describing it as anti-Semitic, as was happening all over the country, especially in the spring of 24, calling Jewish students who were protesting against using their parents' tax dollars to destroy Gaza, calling those students anti-Semitic because they were protesting about Israeli actions. That use of the term is dangerous because it means that it can be turned around, that who are the people who are enforcing this silence, who are enforcing, who are telling people you cannot protest? Who are they? The Jewish donors, the Jewish wealthy people pulling the strings of American power, the Zionists who are sending our boys and girls to fight in the Middle East. So it opens the path to actual anti-Semitism. And that's a very dangerous dynamic. And I think that there has been, whether it is in Jewish organizations or Jewish donors who have been so drunk on their power that they don't understand, and they claim to be representatives of the Jewish community. Of course, they're not. They're representative of their own power. Don't understand how quickly this can turn around. And we've seen some of this already. If you read interviews with the Tucker Carlson, it's right there. It's not very subtle. As for secularism in Israel, I wish, but I don't think that's the direction. When I served in the Israeli army, in combat units and sort of elite units, it was very rare to have anyone who was religious. And now, that's where the recruiting is coming from. If you look at who is now in the mid and top echelons of the military and now also of the security services, it's people who come from the settlers, which is why also Israel would never be able in the near future to remove the settlers. If anybody has these dreams, because who is going to remove them? It has to be the army, the police, the security services. They come from the settlers. So Israel is in the other direction. Will that change over time? I don't see this happening anytime soon. But what I do see is that Israel as a society, despite its bravado and militarism and growing racism, is also very fragile. And it's actually not difficult to show Israel the limits of its power. I still think that President Biden is deeply responsible for what happened in Gaza because, I published a first op-ed on that in early November 23. And I was hoping that people like Biden and Blinken would put an end to it. And they could have. It's not difficult. And they didn't act. But if you put pressure on Israel, it's not going to make it secular. But there are religious people in Israel who are quite moderate. Not all the religious there are fanatic. In fact, there are large numbers of the Orthodox community who are not even Zionists. They're anti-Zionist. They're truly anti-Zionist because they believe that the state should not exist before the Messiah arrives. That's their theology. But they live in Israel and they work with the government. They would work with any government. So they're not all fanatic. So it's not a matter of making it more secular. It's a matter of forcing it to recognize the limits of its power. And that may also then moderate policies.
Okay, so this time, I don't have to rely on my short-term memory. We'll do a first question, but don't yet answer, and then I'll call a second person. So from this side of the room, is there a first question? Okay, Noah.
So, thank you again for the talk. I really do appreciate it. I read the first chapter of your book and watched an interview from TRT. So, in your book, at least with the first chapter, you describe how Zionism evolved into state ideology. that structures perception, reinforces fear, and sustains cycles of violence, particularly through what you call a righteous sense of victimhood, if I remember. And then in your recent interview with TRT News, correct me if I'm wrong, you propose a confederation model with shared but distinct citizenship and resonance. So my question is, if ideology operates at such a deep societal level, what would actually enable a shift in that underlying mindset? Do you think institutional arrangements like a confederation could lead to change? Or do they depend on a prior transformation of ideology that at least seems pretty different from the purity of arms sort of logic with the IDF at this point?
Okay, I'll try to summarize that. So on the one hand, Professor Bartov refers to just this powerful ideology in Israel, the sense of victimhood that really makes any kind of compromise, reconciliation impossible. On the other hand, Professor Bartov, is very receptive to this vision of a Confederate coexistence. So the question is, how would you get to that point in overcoming the ideology? Before you answer that, second question. Okay. All right. Yes, Leila. Yes, okay.
Wanted to go back in terms of prevention of genocide, just to hear your thoughts and invite a little bit more reflection on that, given what we witnessed over the past 40, 50 years in terms of failures in that regard, and especially this pronounced failure. And I also just wanted to ask specifically, the 800 plus genocide scholars, wrote petitions and signaled their concern. But as far as I remember, none of the Holocaust museums came out and said to think about, their role in terms of education, presumably to make sure we all understand that this never does happen again, and just how you can rectify some of those failures.
Okay, so this is all about just how does one really fully expose just the genocide and how to think about getting to never again, including getting scholars to really apply it universally. And then a third one, okay, yes, you're in the back.
So I want to give a little insight into something you talked about in speech. Said your father believed that Netanyahu, the individual, was the modern ruin to the Zionist movement. I just want a little insight into his perspective, and then your perspective as well. What does he mean to the movement of Zionism and the state of Israel and to Parliament? And what is the future of all of that look like without Netanyahu at the helm of the state? And then to top it off, do you think that as it stands, a binational or two-state solution exists under Netanyahu?
All right, so this one is all about Netanyahu, and to the extent that Netanyahu is really the heart of the problem versus perhaps something broader. Oh, okay.
Right. So, Noah, yes, I'm I think in 1978 or something, I wrote an article on victimhood and how victimhood creates a dynamic of victimizing others. That's not, at the time I mentioned Israel, but I was writing also about Germany. We think of the Nazis rightly as genocidal, but they saw themselves as victims. The Nazi movement is born out of a sense of victimhood in World War I, the stab in the back. Who stabbed us in the back? The socialists and the Jews. How do we prevent it? And so forth. So a sense of victimhood, and it may be invented and it may be real, gives you license. And it gives you this sense of righteous victimhood and righteous victimization of others. So first of all, we have to understand that as such, whether we're talking about Zionism and the state of Israel or more generally. You say, how can you have that on the one hand, this mechanism at work, and then talk about a confederation, right? Because these are incompatible. Yes, they are. And the question is, you know, the hen and the egg, what comes first? I hinted at that before. You know, and if you look at opinion polls, you find something quite interesting, that both Palestinians and Jewish Israelis are very skeptical about any potential for peace, and they are very suspicious of each other. But if you dig a little deeper, you see that if they were actually offered something coherent, and if that was offered by leaders that they trust, which they don't have, then people would opt for another alternative, and they have done so in the past. Part of all extremists know that they thrive on a sense of insecurity, of fear, of terror. If you change that paradigm, even a little bit, then you see other forces emerging. As I said before, I don't see the dynamic right now for this coming from the inside without any outside intervention. But if there were that, and if a leadership could emerge, as did, fortunately, in South Africa at a certain point, then things happen that you would not have expected before. I always remind myself that I was living in Berlin in 1987. And there was a beautiful big wall in the middle of the city. I was in West Berlin, so there was a lot of graffiti on it and all that. On the other side, there was just minefields and barbed wire. And nobody thought that that wall would come down. And now you go to Berlin, you can't find it. Where was that wall? Nobody knows. So I think things can change quickly. My sort of work with the Land for All is based in part on the idea that, yes, it cannot be implemented now, but it's very important to have a well-elaborated blueprint so that when circumstances change for one reason or another, you have something to fall back on. You're not in a vacuum, because this vacuum will be filled by other extremists. That's what they are looking for. So yeah, it's not a good answer, but you know, it's the only thing I can say. And Leila, on first of all, on prevention of genocide or stopping genocide, you know, so the Convention on Genocide is a convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, which means that signatory states are duty-bound first to try and prevent it, if they identify that it's about to happen, and B, to punish those who carried it out, if it happened already. And obviously, they've been derelict, certainly in this case. We have to say that that's not always, that has not always been the case. And although punishing genocide is very hard, because genocide is a social event, and you can never punish everyone, there were attempts. There were attempts in Rwanda, there were attempts in Bosnia, there were attempts in Cambodia. There are now international courts that are there for this purpose and are functioning despite huge pressures from this country's government to undermine them. So first of all, we have to understand that. Secondly, genocide historically, at least modern genocide, has ended for two reasons. Either because those carrying it out succeeded in doing what they wanted to. That happened in German Southwest Africa in 1904. That happened also with the Armenians. It was the Ottoman Empire succeeded. And yeah, there was some feeble attempts to bring people to justice. Nothing happened. Or because of intervention. The Holocaust ended because of the Red Army. The genocide in Cambodia ended because of the invasion of the North Vietnamese army. they did not necessarily come in because they wanted to stop the genocide, but it was their intervention that stopped it. The same in Rwanda. It was the Tutsi coming from Uganda and so forth. And when that happens, there is often also then some kind of attempt at justice. Always limited, never satisfactory, but some kind of attempt. As I say, the case right now of Gaza, if it ends the way I fear it may, is an extraordinary precedent, because the genocide was facilitated by the same countries that claim. That's the first time. People will tell you, what about Sudan? What about Russia? What about Myanmar? And those are all terrible cases. But those countries were not supported by Britain, Germany, France, and the US, by countries that claim to be the main bulwark for human rights. If that happens, then then we're facing, first of all, enormous injustice, but also a major threat to the entire architecture, faulty as it is, that was put together after the crimes of the Nazis. And that's a huge danger, and we should think about it. And we should remember that it's, in many ways, it's our role. Samantha Power wrote a book years ago, A Problem from Hell. And she was then a reporter in the former Yugoslavia. And for 2.5 years, people were reporting on the horrors that were happening there, and no country wanted to intervene for various reasons. But eventually, countries did. And it had to do also with reporting and with public outrage. At the time, part of the public outrage was because there were photographs of Bosniaks behind barbed wire who looked like concentration camp inmates. And people made this connection and thought, whoa, this looks like the Holocaust. We can't allow that to happen. Now it's still not happened. And the protests that began were thwarted, were shut down. So, and on Netanyahu as the wrecker of Zionism, was you, right? Yeah. What's your name? Ian. So, look, under Netanyahu, there's no future for any settlement at all. Because Netanyahu, who presents himself a little bit like he's under pressure from his radical right wing and all that, he never wanted a Palestinian state. He will do everything he can to prevent it. He's a very savvy politician. And as long as he's in power, none of that will happen. But he won't be in power forever. Hopefully, he'll be gone sooner than later. Is there beyond that a possibility? Yes, I think so. And I think that the notion of a confederation, which those of you who don't know, I just want to say a couple of words about it, because this idea of a land for all tries to think through what both groups want. What Palestinians and Jews, Zionist Jews in Israel want are two things. They want self-determination and they want a right of return. The Jews in Israel have it. They have a state and they have a law of return. The Palestinians don't have it. They don't have a state, despite the fact that all kinds of countries recognize it. There is no state, and they don't have a right of return. They claim it, but they don't have it. So how do you do that? Considering that the two-state solution, as everybody talked about it, including myself for many years, is dead. There cannot be a normal two-state solution because there are 750,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and they're not removable by force. And even by international law, it may be a complicated matter because you have 3 generations of people living there already as settlers. So what the Confederation plan tries to think about is if you create the two states, more or less along the borders of 1967, but instead of having a big wall between them and cutting all communication between them, you make a distinction between citizenship and residence. So you could be a citizen of one state and reside in another. That's, of course, what the EU have. You can be from Paris and live in Berlin. You get a residence permit and you live in Berlin, but you vote not for the German parliament, you vote for the French parliament. And so if you created a system like that with a confederation superstructure over that of the two states, with Jerusalem being where both states have their own parliaments and also a confederation institutions, then you could be living in Houston, Texas, and trace yourself back to Palestine because your ancestors came from Haifa. And you could go to Palestine, and if Palestine had the same kind of law of return that Israel have, then you would easily become a Palestinian citizen, a citizen of Palestine. And as a citizen of Palestine, you could apply for residence in Haifa. And you could live there as a resident, but you would vote for the Palestinian parliament, and you would have to keep the law. If you broke the law, then you'd be deported to Palestine. And if you're a Jewish settler, and settlers, one assumes that many of them would not want to stay in Palestine, but those who would, they could stay there as residents. But if they got out of their settlements, they started uprooting olive trees, which seems to be what they most like doing, then they would be deported, and they wouldn't be able to stay there. So you would, in a sense, recognize not only the needs of both groups, but you would recognize that both Jews and Palestinians in that country are attached not only to a particular place in that country, but to places that would be on the other side of the border, and the border would be open. Now, is it possible to do that now? No, of course not. But is it possible to try and think how you do that, considering that all the parts of that land are inextricably linked? If you try to do radical surgery and cut it into two, then much of what exists there now would not function. The water table, energy, road system, everything is completely part of the same. So I think that there is a way to envision some kind of future where you would have both countries, but those countries would be constantly, as they are now, one connected to the other. Vast numbers of populations in that pretty small country, what is it, the size of New Jersey or something, are living side by side. They're not living separate from each other. How do you make it possible for them to share the space and have rights and dignity for everyone? So that's what the plan talks about. It won't happen under Netanyahu, and it won't happen under people who will replace him. The opposition in Israel now has no plan for the Palestinians. So it'll be a long process. But the first step has to be the removal of Netanyahu.
All right, we're just about out of time. I actually want to use the last question, make this less than 5 minutes or so. I mean, my question will be very brief. I'm excited about a land for all too. The follow-up I have is, what I like about it is you do have Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs meeting to kind of think about it. So it's not just an abstract blueprint, but it seems like it's a constant collaboration. I guess my question is, particularly since October 7th, how is that going? Is it expanding the amount of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs that are getting together and really trying to think through what this new vision would look like, or has it been put on hold?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was a rise in interest in a land for all. I went to many of those demonstrations between January and October 2023, when there was the attempted and ongoing judicial coup by the government. And there was a stand for Land for All, which was on the corner. It was in Da Vinci, it was called, because that's the corner between Kaplan and Da Vinci, the two streets. And we were sort of standing in the corner. The masses didn't want to talk about that. They just wanted to preserve their own rights. But there was growing interest. Then came October 7th, and I have to say, I know that a number of Palestinians who were involved with the movement just said, well, we can't do it now. I talk with the leaders of that movement. They have their finger on it. They claim that they are gaining more interest now. How much? It's hard to say, but there is, I think, because there is a sense of despair, and the despair is not, say, in the Jewish population, it's not only about what's happening to Palestinians. In fact, it's primarily not about that, but it's about what is happening to Israeli society, because what is so clear is that the actions of Israel in Gaza and now in the West Bank are also rapidly eroding the rule of law in Israel, rapidly destroying whatever is left of any kind of civil society, police control. So people feel desperate for something else. And that seems to sort of introduce another hope. But it's still very small. And it won't grow sufficiently, again, without outside pressure. I don't think so. I think some of those leaders believe that. But I can tell you that we are planning to host at Brown in next April. We've been postponing it for various reasons, but next April to host a meeting with A Land for All, and to also give it much more visibility in the US, because most people in the US have never heard of this thing. And we want to give them more media exposure, because again, if this is known outside of Israel, and if it gets some more exposure, especially in the United States, there's a higher chance that it would also begin to flourish more in Israel.
Okay. Thank you very much for sticking it out, and special thanks to Dr. Bartov.